On another technical note, I always paint in RGB. Some people will tell you to paint in CMYK. Personally, I think that's wrong. They'll say that it'll be more accurate in print, but the thing is that a lot of your image will be seen on a computer monitor in RGB, and you're working in a lot bigger color space when you work in RGB, and it's a lot easier to reduce the color space than to expand it. So I'd say work in RGB, and I'm sure once I put this on the internet, hundreds of people will tell me I am wrong, but I'm sticking to my guns on this one. Another thing people ask a lot is, what size do you work? And my general rule for working is that I work at good print resolutions. A lot of my images I know that I will want to make a print of eventually, so I will work at 300 dpi and whatever will fit on, say, an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. That'll give me a good sized print that'll look nice, and it's usually big enough to do any sort of detailing that I'd want to do in a picture. So that's a good general rule if you're looking for something to work on. You might need a fairly decent machine to be able to do at high resolutions like that, but my computer is a couple years old and doesn't have any trouble doing it. So always work big because it's easier to go down than it is up. And since we're talking about technical things, I will note that the video is having a technical issue right now. The cursor is not lined up with where I'm actually working. I apologize for that. I don't know what happened. It's something with the recording software. Please just try to bear with it and ignore it. It should fix itself in a little bit. The last thing I wanted to mention on a technical note is to calibrate your monitor. One of the things about digital art is that you never really know for certain how someone else on the other side of the world is going to see your picture, because all monitors are calibrated a little bit differently, and if you just go out and buy a monitor, it probably won't be calibrated very well. Your values and your colors will probably be pretty bad, in all honesty. You'll lose probably a lot of your darks, you'll lose maybe some of your lights, and your colors will be all skewed and odds are hyper contrasty. So it's a good idea to check online for good sites on how to calibrate your monitors and do that right away before you start painting, because otherwise you'll upload your image that you think is just this beautiful thing and people will say, I can't see anything, it's all black. And that is not a good way to show your work. So spend some time and calibrate your monitor and save yourself a lot of hassle. Another advantage to calibrating is that when you do go and take this image to a printer, you'll probably have a much better idea of how the image will turn out. Now, I've been working for a while digitally and getting prints done on my work, so one of the rules I've kind of developed for myself is to avoid the really, really dark values on a piece. I find that anything that gets too dark on the piece, even if I can see it clearly on my monitor, see differences in value, most of those really deep dark values will all go straight to black. So if you take a print, it will get really muddy and really overly black. So I find it best to avoid those really deep dark values, and if you're using the HSV sliders, I would recommend, if you're going to get your piece printed, to stay away from anything below, say, a 10 on that slider. You really don't need that deep darkness, except for maybe one or two little punchy highlights, and that would be okay. And it'll save you from going to the printer and thinking you're going to have this beautiful piece and walking out of there with this just black mess that you can't see any of those details that you painted in there. To get away from technical considerations for a while, I wanted to talk a little bit about the more emotional aspects to art. Because art at its core really is an emotional experience. If you don't feel anything from a picture, it's probably not a very successful picture. Now, the things that you feel from the picture don't have to be anything complicated. You don't have to have a life-changing experience every time you look at a painting for it to be a good painting. A very simple emotion like feeling, oh, this is very peaceful. That's good. That's a successful painting, unless you're painting hell, for instance, in which case you probably don't want a very peaceful painting. But even just considering the emotional impact that your piece is going to have on a viewer will really help guide your painting process. And if you can make a piece that really stirs an emotion in someone, then you've probably made a really beautiful piece. Another thing to consider about painting is instilling a narrative in your piece. Now, I'm coming from an illustrator's perspective on this, but I think that having a narrative or a story, or even just a simple implication of a backstory happening, will add so much depth to your piece, not physical depth, but emotional depth, that I think it's something to really consider and strive for. So in this piece, I did try to instill a little bit of narrative in it. It's not really over the top, a really complicated narrative, but there's enough there that maybe you'd start to wonder, hey, what's going on with this? There's these people trudging along in matching outfits, I guess, along this, snow-covered terrain towards this doorway. And maybe you'd wonder what's happening, and that's enough of a narrative that it will add a little bit of depth to your piece, and I think that's just enough to work. Since this is just a concept piece and not too much of a story illustration, you don't need to go much beyond that. But moving it beyond just a painting of a pretty place will add something a little special to your paintings. So even if you're working on just a concept piece, try to take it beyond just a concept. Try to put a little bit of narrative in there. Try to put a little bit of feeling in there. Try to move it beyond that just a concept piece. And I'm saying all of this because it's from personal experience. I struggled for quite a while with having any sort of narrative or emotional depth in my work. I loved painting pretty landscapes, but there was nothing to them. There was nothing to hold on to. So I got some great advice from a guy, and he told me, don't just paint landscapes, paint illustrations of the landscapes. And that was just a revelation for me. All of a sudden, I had a whole new approach to how I worked on these landscapes and environments. No longer did I just want to paint a pretty place, but I wanted to figure out, okay, what's the story behind this? How did this place come to be? Why would anyone come here? Where did these buildings come from? Why are these people traveling through this place? And once I got to start thinking on that track, it really moved my work along exponentially. And while I've still got, of course, a long way to go with my work, I think it's something that a lot of people can take away from this, is don't just paint a piece of a place, but try to think of a story for that place. This goes even more so for character work. Don't just paint a character, but try to think about, okay, what's this character like? What are their feelings? What are their motivations? And once you do that, your work will have a complexity, a depth to it that will probably win out over the competition. Another question people ask is, how much reference imagery do you use? And usually my answer is not as much as I should. I did use some reference images for this to get some of the colors of the snow and some of the shapes of the rocks. But for the most part, it's all from my head. And that's kind of a bad practice to get into, because if you do it for long enough, you'll tend to regurgitate the same ideas over and over. And once you look back on your work, it'll really show. Now, some people have the idea that if they're looking at references or looking at other artists' works, that their own artistic purity will be tainted somehow. Somehow their own original ideas will get overshadowed because of the stuff they're looking at. And that's simply not true. The key to avoiding that problem is to look at not fewer things, but more things, to look at more imagery, to look at more artists. And once you start doing that, any of the danger of simply being a copycat artist pretty much goes away. So when you're starting to work on an image, I would advise, especially if you're starting out, to grab a ton of reference imagery so you have something to work from. You have some idea of how the light is going to fall, or the colors are going to fall, or some specific architecture you need for the scene, some costuming if it's a character. Those little things that will really add a lot to your piece. I would also say to do painted studies of reference images just for their own sake. Copying photos and studying from them is a great way to learn. I mentioned earlier that I did a lot of work from life painting landscapes, and I was very spoiled because I happen to live in an area that has just beautiful landscapes all around me. Some people aren't quite so lucky. So photography is a great way to study. There are some definite disadvantages to working from photos. The colors aren't quite as accurate. The value range is much smaller than the human eye typically handles, and the whole image will tend to flatten out. So there's some considerations you should have in the back of your head while you're doing these, but at the same time, I would recommend that if you're looking to learn, to do some studies of photographs. Obviously, if you're working from someone else's photograph, you shouldn't claim it as your own because you don't have the copyright, in which case I'd say to start shooting your own reference photography. It doesn't hurt to have a file on your computer of all of the shots that you've taken so that you know that you can always pull from those to study from those, and you never have to worry about the copyright. And when you're taking the photographs, even just the act of taking them can teach you a lot about painting. The discipline of photography is very interrelated with painting. Learning composition and learning the best angle to shoot something from and learning good lighting from bad lighting all carries over to painting. And when you learn it in photography, you've pretty much learned it in painting. You just need to apply the techniques. It's one of the aspects of art that really fascinates me, is how interrelated all the fields really are. One of the things that helped my drawing and painting skills the most is actually a sculpture class. I took it, and after that, I had a totally newfound appreciation for form and conveying form that has influenced pretty much every piece I've done since then. So if you ever have the opportunity to take a sculpture class or a photography class, it's only going to help your painting skills. Not to mention, when you do that and have that fresh experience of art, you're going to get that original joy that you found doing painting or drawing come back up again. And at the end of the day, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, you're probably not going to do a very good job at it. And I think with art especially, you really need to love what you're doing. And there's several reasons for this. There's the very practical standpoint that there's a lot of people out there doing art, and there's a lot of people that really love it. And frankly, the people that love it are probably going to do a lot better job than the people who are doing it just because it's a job. It's a way to make money. So I would say really try to enjoy it. And I would say that probably most of the people getting into art at one point really loved doing art. And really try to hold on to that. Hold on to that feeling that you had when you first were drawing. Even as a kid doing little doodles or sketches or just creating things, it's that great experience that will hopefully stay with you for your entire career as an artist. When you have that energy, your art is just bound to be a little bit more special than the person who's doing it just because they need to pay the bills. And of course, we all do need to pay the bills. I really desperately need to be making money doing this stuff. So there's that in the back of my head. But at the end of the day, I really enjoy what I'm doing.